The first is Professor Itay Shani from Sun Yat-sen University in China. He'll be speaking on the invisible compass, on the relevance of the spiritual impulse for rational philosophical inquiry. Please join me in welcoming Professor Itay Shani.
Hello and good morning, everybody. It's my pleasure to be the first speaker of today, in this wonderful event, and thanks everybody for putting the effort. One thing I'm going to say, so I chose to read a paper. I hope it's going to come across as clear enough. And, 30 minutes is not a long time. So you have to make a choice, and either you're very focused on a specific question, or if you try to ask more generally the relevance of, the meeting point of philosophy and spirituality, which was I was trying to do, you're bound to be somewhat impressionistic. So my apologies perhaps to the more like professional philosophers here. But we got to think of it as part of a larger project, so where things could be articulated further, and so on. Okay, so the paper is not long. Let's begin. Socrates, the mythical father of Western philosophy, embodies in his seemingly paradoxical persona the following three threads. First, an unwavering determination to pursue, by way of rational discourse, an uncompromised inquiry into first principles. Second, an orientation towards an inspirational connection to a transpersonal source of meaning and value. And third, a commitment to walk the walk, that is, to realize one's philosophical ideals and convictions in one's way of life and mode of conduct. It is interesting to reflect upon the varied careers of these three threads. The first and the last are familiar to any student of philosophy. We easily associate them not only with Socrates and his documented life mission, but also with the very idea of philosophy itself, conceived as the pursuit of the examined life. We are, of course, aware that somewhere along the march of history, these two fundamental ideals parted ways, and philosophy developed into an intellectual pursuit. And talking about philosophy in the West, actually, obviously, a lot of appreciation for Indian philosophy, and I'm going to mention it a little here, but I basically trace the development of philosophy in the West. So we are, of course, aware that somewhere along the march of history, these two fundamental ideals parted ways, and philosophy developed into an intellectual pursuit whose conduct is largely decoupled from the practical imperative to live the good life. Yet, it is not too often that we pause to seriously ask why, or as Pierre Hadot puts it, and I quote, why is it that today philosophy is presented as above all a discourse, which may be theoretical and systematic or critical, but in any case lacks a direct relationship to the philosopher's way of life. It is, however, the second thread, which is by far the least understood to contemporary philosophical observers, both in its relevance to Socrates' own philosophy and to philosophy at large. It stands, of course, for the spiritual element in this triad. In the persona of Socrates, this spiritual element is clearly noted. First, it is exemplified in those long standstill meditations he was known to have practiced from time to time, absorbed in complete self-forgetfulness. Second, and more famously still, it is illustrated in the beatific vision of the erotic impetus, related by Socrates' character in both Plato's dialogue, the Symposium and the Phaedrus, a mystical impulse which drives the philosophically minded towards ever higher plateaus of self-transcendence and ultimately towards an ecstatic apprehension of divine absolute beauty. Yet contemporary observers find it hard to understand properly, let alone to fully appreciate, the relevance and significance of this spiritual dimension for the rest of the philosophical enterprise, either as expressed in the Platonic figure of Socrates, or by extension when considering philosophy at large. As we gather here to reflect upon the re-emergence of spirituality as a legitimate object of philosophical inquiry, and moreover, to reconsider spirituality's role in the very fabric of philosophy, I shall venture, with some trepidation, to offer a few thoughts on this subject. In particular, I shall focus on the claim that the most significant benefit which philosophy stands to gain from revitalizing its atrophied connections to spirituality is a potentially renewed sense of having a center, a terminus, orientation toward which provides the philosophical undertaking as a whole with a general bearing capable of nourishing a truly integral outlook. I shall attempt to highlight some of the positive transformative consequences of such potential reorientation, but in doing so, I will also comment on a major challenge. I'm actually not doing all of that. I only comment on one thing, focus mostly on one thing, and doesn't really address the challenge here, but maybe in a larger articulation of the paper. Okay, so section number 2, to have a center. Let me begin by commenting on how I understand the term spirituality, since there is certainly no consensus on its usage in the contemporary literature on the subject. As indicated earlier, I take spirituality to consist in an orientation towards and an inspirational connection to a transpersonal source of meaning and value. The key point, insofar as our present concerns are involved, is the emphasis on the claim that spirituality involves standing in relation to a transcendent dimension. This excludes the idea that mere personal self-fulfillment or self-actualization qualifies as spiritual. It also precludes the notion that spirituality may consist in something like the enrichment of one's being through engagement in a broader network of social and environmental relations. While such practices may sometimes converge onto the spiritual path, spirituality itself consists of more than that. It involves an attempt to establish resonant relationship with a great beyond, namely with a transcendent source of meaning, value, and being. Given such understanding of spirituality, we can now proceed in our endeavor to establish the claim that a re-spiritualization of philosophy carries the promise of sustaining a more integral approach to the subject and its practice. Before we engage with any details, however, let us focus first on the underlying general idea. A spiritual orientation to life is one which affirms the perennial notion that there is a center of things. It implies the idea that concrete reality is not merely extensive, pertaining to the unfolding of things in space and time, but also intensive, meaning that it contains a dimension of depth or height of existence. More specifically, it involves the concept of a gradation of being, which in large measure corresponds to the existence of grades of consciousness. Finally, at the core of this picture is the idea that the ultimate ground of being is also that which stands at the apex of this ontic edifice. It is therefore immanent as well as transcendent. It underlies all there is, while at the same time surpasses all. Now, in a world in which there is depth to being, that which constitutes the ultimate ground of all things is also the ultimate ground of subjectivity and selfhood. It lies at the innermost core of one's individual subjective existence, while at the same time transcending all finite forms of consciousness, which is why in the Chandogya Upanishad we find the assertion that he, myself within the heart, is that Brahman. It follows that spiritual orientation is simultaneously inwards and upwards. The way in towards the deepest recesses of one's conscious being is the way up towards a transcendence of self. Or as Meister Eckhart puts it, and when I say the innermost, then I mean the highest. And when I say the highest, I mean the innermost part of the soul. There is therefore a clear sense in which a conception of the world as containing a spiritual dimension is also one in which things have a center, an underlying hub connecting all things at their core, a permanent ground subtending all change and contingency, and a radiant source of meaning and value towards which one may turn receptively or away from which one may retreat. Okay, I proceed to section number 3, Despiritualized, our 20th century legacy. Sorry. In an intellectual environment permeated by the belief that the world has a center, at once transcendent and immanent, which serves as the ground of being as well as the ultimate source of meaning and value, it is natural to suppose that the observable and/or apprehensible structure of reality in its various different aspects, physical, metaphysical, moral, aesthetic, social, is an expression of this ground, perhaps this divine ground. The unity of the ground, itself a function of its exalted simplicity and perfection, confers a measure of unity and coherence upon this manifold of expressions, even as the latter are nowhere nearly as perfect or as unified as the ground itself. Such an outlook, therefore, sustains faith in the essential interrelatedness of all things and in the possibility of articulating substantive truths about the world, physical, metaphysical, moral, aesthetics, and so on, from within what, in principle at least, is a single unified matrix. As is well known, however, the history of modern Western thought bears testimony to the breakdown of this integral vision, and with it to the diminution of the place of the spiritual. Part of it began already in the late Middle Ages with the rise of nominalism, which brought about increased skepticism concerning the ability of the mind, of the human mind, to penetrate the nature of things through rational speculation, and the opening of an epistemic chasm between the empirical and the spiritual realms. This trend intensified with the advent of modern science and modern philosophy in the 17th century, which pressed upon us the mind-body problem and the removal of subjectivity, purpose, agency, and qualitativity from the domain of nature. Other crucial milestones can and should be counted as well, especially during the 19th century. Think of Darwin or Marx or Freud or Nietzsche or the advent of positivism. But it is the 20th century that epitomizes the most complete and far-reaching departure of intellectual thought, and philosophy in particular, from the realm of the spiritual. Since somewhere in the 1920s and throughout the rest of the century, philosophy was dominated to an unprecedented degree by secularist and atheist sentiments. Despite the enormous differences between them, the two main avenues for pursuing philosophical inquiry, the analytic and the continental, were in agreement not only in their intense focus on language, but also in the rejection of all things transcendent. This has led to a severe marginalization of the spiritual dimension, and for a long while to a hostile attitude to metaphysics as well. Needless to say, however, these trends developed rather differently within the two schools. Simplifying matters to a degree that may raise some protest, the difference can be summarized in the following manner. We can label the dominant undercurrents within the analytic side of the aisle as scientistic, insofar as they emulated Locke's conception, John Locke, that the status of philosophy in a world dominated by the empirical sciences is that of an under-laborer, clearing ground a little and removing some of the rubbish that lies in the way of knowledge. That's a quote from Locke. Correspondingly, we can designate the prevalent undertones within the continental side of the divide as nihilistic, insofar as they furnished the undermining of all epistemic authority and the stigmatization of the core heritage of Western philosophy, in particular its metaphysical legacy, as not merely misguided or discredited, but also inherently oppressive. Yet, as the organizers of the present event mentioned in their seminar note, things are changing considerably at the moment. The renaissance of metaphysics over the last few decades, the globalization of philosophy with its correlative rise in the stature of cross-cultural studies, an increase in the plurality of and boundaries of tolerance within the discipline, and of course the general drift of popular culture, all are significant contributors to the surge of interest in spirituality and to the growing willingness to reconsider its place in the general scheme of things. But I wish to approach the question by focusing on a topic that is close to my heart, namely consciousness. As Section 4, the problem of consciousness is a portal to the reaffirmation of the spiritual. It is no secret that the dramatic resurgence of interest in the problem of consciousness since the turn of the millennium constitutes a watershed point in the development of contemporary analytic philosophy. And we heard about it yesterday as well, and so on. The celebrated hard problem of consciousness, which was swept underneath the carpet for decades, forced philosophers to confront the skeleton in their closet. The effort to portray concrete reality in a manner fully subservient to the scientific image, the endeavor to explain the nature of things solely in respect of their objective measured appearances, reaches here a challenge that carries all the clear marks of a veritable dead end. Consciousness, it appears, cannot be reduced to the physical as the latter is commonly conceived, nor can concrete reality be fully identified with the world's scientifically measurable exteriors. The first point motivates the conclusion that consciousness is ontologically fundamental and has played a major role in the recent revival of panpsychism. The second point stresses that physical descriptions of reality are essentially structural, leaving the intrinsic nature of things inscrutable or unaccounted for. If correct, it implies that as a general picture of reality, the scientific image is necessarily and substantively incomplete. Things have an inner side to their being, not fully captured by descriptions of their external appearances. In fact, I think these 2 points I mentioned are like two different sides of the same coin or the same issue. Now, if consciousness is fundamental, and if nature has an inner side to its being, the landscape is already significantly more receptive to spiritual matters than anything a strictly physicalist approach could sustain. Though perhaps we will hear from Jeff later something different. I'll be looking forward to that. But how far does it actually take us in respect of accommodating spirituality? Upon reflection, it is clear, I think, that the answer is not far enough. A bottom-up panpsychist outlook might make us feel more at home in the universe, and a nature presumed to be teeming with sentience is likely to be met with an enhanced sense of wonder and reverie. Perhaps such attitude does qualify as spiritual, but if it does, it merely touches the surface. What is missing from the picture is a dimension of transpersonal depth, and therefore of genuine transcendence. In a world of such kind, there is no center, and no possibility of orienting ourselves towards the innermost and the highest. Yet an alternative species of panpsychism is cosmopsychism, a position which identifies fundamental reality with a cosmic level consciousness. And here things take a different turn, since it is possible to articulate the view in such a manner that this cosmic consciousness simply is the transcendent cum immanent center mentioned above. Not all advocates of cosmopsychism venture so far, but some do. And in my own variation of the view, it converges onto a form of panentheism, a doctrine which doubtlessly fits the bill when it comes to the question of accommodating a genuine spiritual outlook. So my last section, spirituality as the glue between reason and conduct. Imagine now a philosophy credibly reanimated with the spiritual impulse. And let us turn finally to briefly consider some potential implications. And as I mentioned, I'll focus actually only one here. While the most significant repercussions in the long run are arguably those that are likely to affect culture at large, I focus here especially on potential consequences for philosophy itself. Earlier, I stated that a revitalization of the spiritual impulse as an integral aspect of the practice of philosophy carries the promise of nourishing a more whole and wholesome approach to the subject. in particular by conferring upon it an improved sense of overarching coherence and unity. I was tempted to try to illustrate this claim by attending to the question of the potential reintegration of the true, the good, and the beautiful, but this is a difficult matter which I cannot venture to address on this occasion. Instead, let us return to where we left Socrates at the beginning of our discussion and consider the present disconnect between the two traditional constitutive ideals with which philosophy is most conspicuously associated in the West: the pursuit of knowledge of first principles by way of rational discourse, and the pursuit of a virtuous life. While there are many external factors, social, cultural, economical, technological, institutional, behind the dissociation of the two and the relative marginalization of the second, and there's some interesting work on how this also started already in the Middle Ages. And while it is definitely impossible to return to anything that resembles closely the manner in which philosophy was practiced in ancient Greece and the Hellenistic period, I submit that the main internal factor motivating the split was the decline of the spiritual impulse as a preeminent aspect of the practice of philosophy. In a world conceived to be centered around the divine ground, at once immanent and transcendent, reason and conduct are two complementary channels for establishing proper resonance with it. There are two pathways which must be pursued harmoniously if such resonance is to be achieved. Moreover, it is the spiritual impulse itself, the mystical sense, if you will, along with proper spiritual work, which serves as the pivot in this centripetal dynamics. For it is this which brings us into our closest and most direct contact with the unfathomable inner nature of the ultimate ground. This is not to suggest that reason must be dedicated exclusively to the practical purpose of achieving enlightenment or salvation, nor that it must be devoted solely to inquiries directed at the highest cause. Rather, being itself, as its own intrinsic value, or we can also say being itself expressive of the inner light, there is value in the practice of reason and in the truths it manages to illumine, apart from practical benefits as well, of course. Likewise, and for similar reasons, nor do I mean to suggest that every virtuous act must be performed deliberately for the sake of achieving greater rapport with the big transcendent. What I mean when I claim center stage to spiritual orientation in this context is that precisely because it can bring us into our closest and most direct contact with the center of things, it can also furnish us with an inner compass, I guess hence the title of my talk, with an inner compass by whose guiding ineffable light both reason and conduct, our visible means of practicing the philosophical life, are calibrated and are harmonized with each other. In conclusion, it seems to me that rather than being an eccentric, ill-understood, and somewhat embarrassing feature in the figure of Socrates, his mystical feats might have played a vital role in guiding and integrating the two celebrated philosophical ideals so famously associated with his life mission, the pursuit of knowledge and the pursuit of virtue. We should bear this in mind when we contemplate the Socratic ideal of the examined life as a symbol for philosophy. Thank you.
Thank you.
Should be on time, right?
Sit over there. Yeah, that was perfect. Thank you so much to Professor Itay Shani for his wonderful presentation. This is one of those rare occasions when an academic leaves time, this extra time. So we have an extra 7 minutes for Q&A, which is great. So instead of 15 minutes, we have about 22 to 23 minutes. Our procedure is going to be, first of all, let's all take out our phones and please put them on silent mode or turn them off completely. It's very rude for phones to be going off in the middle of presentations, and it's very distracting. Okay, with that said, we're going to open up questions first to the presenters, and then after the presenters have a chance to speak, we're going to open up to the general audience. So any questions about Professor Shani's presentation from the presenters first? And if you do, you can just come up to either of those standing mics. Yeah, please, Jeff.
Hi, thanks so much for the fascinating talk. Yeah, so I just wanted to ask you to say a little bit more about how you understand the distinction between the immanent and the transcendent. Am I doing good? Okay. In particular, I'm just wondering whether we should limit our idea of the spiritual outlook to people who hold a particular kind of metaphysics involving something like transcendent entities beyond space and time. So in particular, I know some people who are Buddhists who definitely would consider themselves to be living a spiritual life. They're following the teachings of the Buddha. They engage in spiritual practices like meditation and so on. But they also would say they don't believe in anything beyond just the immanent physical world. And I think there's a sort of a possible accusation that it's somewhat arbitrary to require a certain kind of metaphysics to accompany a spiritual outlook, rather than engaging in a particular kind of sort of philosophically oriented lifestyle that is concerned with big questions about the place of humanity in the world and so on and so forth. So, that's my question.
Okay, I'm not sure I understood the last part, the last thing you said. What was the rougher?
I'm just trying to suggest an alternative vision of what it would mean to have a spiritual outlook that wouldn't necessarily require particular metaphysical commitment of the individual who considers themselves spiritual.
Right. Thank you. Yes. So if we start with the last thing you said, as I mentioned, there are different conceptions, right? There's definitely disagreement. Yeah. And even in my own paper, you could see some kind of tension in the sense that when I talked about this other kind of panpsychism, I said that a certain level of whatever, when you feel this sense of, forget about any theories, right? If you have this sense of awe in nature, right, in the face of nature or something, there's a certain, perhaps, level of spiritual either yearning or experience, right? And that regardless of what we believe, and we definitely don't have to accept a certain package of the sort that I was emphasizing in order to have that, right? But the question is, my view, that would basically come, whether you acknowledge it or aware of it or not, but the claim here is that it's essentially the underlying dynamics is coming to contact with something that have this level of depths of being that I was talking about, right? And that could be the case even if someone doesn't already buy into this idea, right? It's a claim about the source of this contact with a spiritual dimension. About Buddhism, it sort of confuses me because there are so many different schools, and right? Mm-hmm. And in some of them, definitely, the Buddhahood definitely comes closer to something it's surely transcendent, right? Anything about, all the talk about, consciousness is alaya and so on. So, but there are other variants of Buddhism when perhaps it's again, I would be inclined to think that it's not really just the world or something, right? It's not just this kind of thing.
Can you say? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, even in the terminology could be confusing, right? Because if you think of a different context, Spinoza, for example, you could say, well, this is pantheism, right? But it's definitely, so God is nature, but it's, what do you understand by nature? What he understands by nature is something that does have this element, I guess, of ontic depth that I was trying to emphasize.
I guess where I'm left with that is wanting to hear a little bit more about what counts as ontic depth, what counts as the transcendent.
Yes, yeah. So, the first thing you mentioned about the immanent and transcendence, that's really something that you find, I think, very strongly in spiritual approaches or in what we may call the perennial philosophy all over the world, right? So you get this idea, never mind the label, in something like panentheism is the view that, so this source is, or this ground is actually sustaining everything, right? So it's like the ground of reality, that's the measure of immanence, but it's also not exhausted by it, right? not exhausted just by the manifest world. It kind of like, the manifest world comes from somewhere that is also beyond that. So that's the element of transcendence as well. And transcendence also in the sense that the depth of being there is perhaps immeasurable, right? That's why when we have this powerful experience of actually coming to contact with it, it's also this ineffable and this something that you cannot really articulate. But now you are pressing more what constitutes, right? Or to try to account for it philosophically. You're right. That's really something that I'm really just beginning to try to develop, right? This notion, as I mentioned, that reality is not just. So I'm intrigued by this distinction, actually, intention and extension, right? This idea, because we tend to think of it in philosophy nowadays as more like semantic and so on. But if you think of Descartes' notion of extension, which is very strong in our thinking about the nature of matter, right? That which extends. There was also in the history of philosophy throughout the Middle Ages, and I think it influenced people like Leibniz and so on, this issue that there's an ontic sense also to intention, which is the opposite, which gives you this element of depth. And depth, I think you find only in consciousness. So it's kind of like ontology that actually says that ontic depth is something that would have to be articulated as this notion of level of being would have to be articulated as aspects of consciousness.
Okay, maybe we should open it up to other questions, if that's okay. Any other presenters before we, please come up to the mic. After Professor Goeke's question, we'll open up to the general audience.
Cool. Thanks so much for your paper. I just asked myself whether you could say a few more words on what, according to your opinion, is responsible for the decline of spirituality in like Western philosophy. You started with Socrates, and then you draw the lines through the high Middle Ages, and then you started with nominalism. So, and you said that today that we are focusing again more on consciousness and on the irreducibility of consciousness. We see also a return of spirituality. But could you say what in the years like, well, what in the 19th or 20th century maybe was responsible for the decline of spirituality, so that in the Western continental and analytic philosophy, somehow nobody took it seriously anymore? So could you say just a few words on
yes,
that?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Again, I mean, if you, as I mentioned, and you mentioned as well, there are certain elements that can be identified already in the late Middle Ages and so on. And it's very interesting, I think, with the thing about nominalism, just getting into that more. We'll try to, that if you think of it broadly, there was a certain growing skepticism regarding the possibility of kind of like having this, whatever you call it, whether you call it intellectual intuition or you know, those inner lights, you know, the sort of Augustinian kind of thing that you can grab, you know, vision of the forms, right, in the mind of God or something like this, right? So the mechanism that was kind of like supporting, and this, like it comes as a whole package. It's a certain epistemology and a certain worldview as well. That was, so it's growing. What we find in nominalism is this idea that, you know, we focus more on nature and we leave theology to theology, or to you know, what was called into question is the rational theology, right? So that's an important step in itself, even in a world which was still very much religious. So even the nominalists were, definitely, right? But then later, of course, you have this process of the rise of science and the decline, in some sense, of at least the claims, the knowledge claims of religion and so on, right? But what you see in the 19th century is very interesting, because in one sense it's, you know, we get Darwin's theory of natural selection, which is a very important event and so on, but you also have a rise in idealism. You got idealism at the beginning of the century, and you got it in the Anglo-Saxon world at the end of the century. Very interesting, right? So if you read people, which I like to do a lot, people from about 100 years ago, whether it's the pragmatists or the idealists, or many, you have this tension, right? People that were very much devoted to engaging with the sciences while they do philosophy, but were also, at least many of them, struggling to find a place for the spiritual. And something changed, as I mentioned, after the First World War. So I think it's the First World War, the end of empire, the fact that in the 1920s all the big idealists die, basically, and you get a new generation. We see many different things, right? We see in science, quantum mechanics and so on, like a different world comes out. But also, we then see positivism and behaviorism and a very stark kind of commitment to try to create this world this worldview. So I think that was a thing. It's like a sharp breakup that led us to several decades of a very kind of like severe outlook, and then gradual relaxation maybe over the last several decades. But definitely, it's mostly the the death of God, so to speak, in the West, I would say.
Okay, we can take some questions from the audience. Please raise your hand if you have a question. Yeah, Professor Shaw, why don't you come to the mic?
Thanks to the speaker. Now, I would like to ask two questions. One is that consciousness is necessary for spirituality, but would like to know exact definition of spirituality and what is the sufficient condition for realizing spirituality. Consciousness is necessary, but not sufficient condition for spirituality. So what are the conditions which will make it sufficient? And secondly, exactly what you mean by spirituality, because there are different senses of spirituality, and what will lead to spirituality.
Yeah. Well, thank you. So regarding the first thing, as you mentioned it yourself, it's definitely necessary consciousness, right? But not sufficient, and well, I agree. So that's why I mentioned that that's how I presented it actually, as a move that creates a space, right? A space for re-engagement with the spiritual, but it's only a preliminary condition. And then again, if you ask what is a sufficient condition for spirituality, well, that's a big thing because again, we have to sort of like perhaps be able to accommodate various manifestations of spirituality, as well as various levels perhaps of intensity and so on, right? Which may make it much more difficult to provide something like the definition you're looking for. But I was looking at what seems to me to be representative of perhaps what's the most powerful forms, right, potentially, of spiritual engagement, and the way I think it kind of like works in, and that's where I mentioned this sort of a, commitment. It's like really orientation. I use it as the word orientation. So trying to come into some sort of a live relationship, right, with this ground of being. And so because it's in that sense that you can find this notion of centering, and also of also going the other way around, also something like when everything goes wrong in your so I still think that this captures something important, and I would if I would try to be more precise, I would still develop that idea around this notion of, as I mentioned.
Okay, thank you. Next question from the audience. Yes, why don't you come to the mic? This will probably be the last question. We have 5 minutes.
Very good morning to learned speakers. In our Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, we are told one story by Sisi Thakur. One farmer in his old age, about one son was born in his family. So suddenly, by snake bite, that son, baby, was expired. When this news goes to the farmer, he came back from the field to the family members. Everybody was weeping and crying, particularly the wife of the farmer. So suddenly some gossiping is there. You see the cruel person. His son is dead, but he is not at all weeping. So suddenly, then, very calmly, that farmer replied, I dreamed yesterday that I am a father of 7 established sons. Now I am thinking, what for should I weep? For that 7 sons or this baby? If you kindly say, madam, explain where is the consciousness is here, spirituality and the philosophy kindly.
Okay, thank you for. I'm not sure.
Could you clarify your question very, very quickly? We have 2 minutes. If you can ask a very simple question, and then he can try to answer it.
Is that farmer has really felt the consciousness? Or he is really a spiritual person? Or by nature he is a philosopher?
Brahman. You said is
That
Brahman?
Farmer. The farmer in Sri Ramakrishna's story.
Yeah.
Is he a true philosopher or is he a spiritual person? Is that the question? I think the question is a little confusing.
I apologize, but I don't think
let's let it drop. Yeah,
answer.
thank you. We have time for one question, I guess. A very quick question. Yeah, go ahead. You can please come. Dr. Chopra, you can come to the mic. Please keep the question extremely succinct. We only have 3 minutes.
Thank you so much. I have a question. The way consciousness is understood in the Western and Indic cosmologies are very different, very stark apart. So how do we bring in the convergence and your views on establishing an entirely different methodology to understand the universality of this methodology so that we can fit it into the larger ambit of science?
Yes, so...
if at all we have to fit it.
Well, again, I'm not sure... if you emphasize the universality, right? So one of the things that strike me is, and of course this is a largely debated topic, and Swami here knows about it. It's been written about it, but for me, it's striking that there is the kind of thing that you're researching, right? That there is, so there is this term, the perennial philosophy, and there's a big debate whether there really is kind of like universal experiences or some constant over the experiences of people from different cultures, different times, different geographies, right? But for me, it strikes me quite that there's a lot of similarity. That if you read Eckhart, Christian mystique, and you read Plotinus, or you look at the Indian sources, you find very similar experiences, right? So I think that there is something that, despite what constructivists are saying, there is something that is universal and therefore could sustain also investigation that of it as a unified phenomenon, so to speak. Even though there are different sentiments, right? So if you study a Sufist, right, and you find all this rapturous excitement and so on, is very, very different than the sentiment you find in Japanese, Zen kind of thing, right? That adds to the complication. But
Wonderful. Thank you so much. That's time, and we will move on to our next speaker. Thank you so much to Professor Itay Shani. Our next speaker is Professor Marzenna Jakubczak from Pedagogical University of Krakow, Poland. Her presentation will be on how to philosophize about the knowledge-granting spiritual experience. Please join me in welcoming Professor Jakubczak. Sure.
Hello, everybody, and first let me thank Swami and Anand also, who is with us mentally, for organizing this, this excellent forum for discussion, this very hard topic, but let us try. Well, my attempt is a bit comparative, a bit mixed in resources. One of the resources that I will be referring to, I received from Swami, his newly published paper. So at some point I will also refer to some interesting points from this. I would like to cover today three main points. First, I'd like to explain what I mean by philosophizing about spiritual experience, what is the basics, I think, we need to do to start discussing. And then I would like to focus more narrowly on Samkhya Yoga view and the knowledge-granting spiritual experience we can find in this context. And I will conclude with referring to solving an easy problem of consciousness, which was neglected yesterday during the key speech. But I think that we are obsessively focused on hard problems, while solving the so-called easy problem may bring a lot of inspiration and support for spirituality, like re-emerging spirituality. So this is what I will be trying to show you in which way this goes in line. So philosophizing about spiritual experience. Well, let us first make it clear, what are we talking about? So are we talking about all religious experiences, or perhaps even broader, like altered states of consciousness, which might appear spontaneously or be induced by different ways? Or we are more making it more narrow and just want to focus on mystical experience, which is a kind by itself. I think the first choice would not be a good one, because for my topic, a lot of examples of religious experience, which is proper religious experience, is not about granting knowledge. And this extra feature I would like to discuss today. And apart from this, the altered states of consciousness partly might be knowledge-giving, partly are not. So the mystical experience seems to be the best candidate to go deeper. So then another general look at the topic, the source. Yeah, this is very important. If we want to include in discussing spiritual experience both spontaneously generated states and induced intentionally, the states which we know how to induce We have ways to proceed. We know what to do with these states. Why do we need them for? So this is a different approach. Spontaneous states are very highly ranked for religious experience, right? Because they are like a gift, like a special sign. And these induced states are looked down by people who are religious in a traditional way, because this is like messing with something which should not depend on our wish. I'm talking about Abrahamic religions especially. Then we are clear. In Indian traditions, inducing spiritual experience is the way to go, right? And of course, from the context of contemporary scientific approach, these induced states have this benefit that we can experiment on them. So we can prepare observation, we can then really get some knowledge, because we are like sort of understanding the circumstances, right? And speaking about the altered states of consciousness, most of people associate this term with the pioneer of psychedelic experiences and transpersonal psychology, Stanislav Grof, but of course altered states of consciousness can appear and do appear spontaneously in our dreams, daydreams, night dreams, and out-of-body experience, near-death experience. They are also, pathological states of mind are altered states of mind. And it's not rare that people who experience some kind of pathological mental states, they interpret these states in a spiritual manner. And we should not neglect it, I think. But of course, altered states of consciousness are also pharmacologically induced, or they can be induced by meditation, hypnosis, etc. And this is an interesting phenomenon nowadays that after many years of neglecting and looking down on pharmacological way of inducing, now we come to the point that we can really use, for instance, ketamine. We have excellent research results now that microdoses are very efficient in drug-resistant depression. So it's a great help for people suffering from this kind of disease. And psychotherapy, which may include a spiritual inspiration, is very welcome in the process of healing. So this is also interesting example. And then when we keep our focus on mystical experience, we have, of course, a very, very long and very rich debates about terminology, about epistemic values, if and on which conditions they might be recognized. So to be very, very brief, to select just a few, mystical experience is about direct communication and union of a human being with ultimate reality, called also sacrum. Or more precisely, or in a more developed version, it is a direct insight which is the most valuable source of knowledge. And it is a knowledge-granting experience which can be either intuitively grasped or super senses perception can be the source, or it can be got through revelation. However, we should never forget, like philosophizing on mystical or spiritual experience, that we have quite a few very, very strong arguments that, well, mystical experience is all about emotional things. It's just devoid of noetic value at all, as Russell strongly claimed, right? And others who want to see that way would refuse this knowledge-granting factor. But let us go into this comparative discussion for a very brief moment, and I will just refer to two early scholars, early like in the 50s. So Zeiner, who was interested in comparative perspective and was spending time on reading texts carefully, came to the conclusion that we have no universal features of the mystical experience. And he also included, at that time, a novelty source, which is through using mescaline, and he used phrase madness as this altered states of consciousness which come from depression or other disease. So he believed whatever kind of mysticism we focus on, even these traditional religious paths, not these induced ones, we end up with seeing differences. So he gives these three basic categories: nature mystics, which would be mostly what we were discussing before, the pantheistic perspective, or isolation mystics, according to him, both Samkhya Yoga, surprisingly, and monistic non-dualist Vedanta belong to this category. So we isolate body from spiritual core. And the Abrahamic religions, which seemed for this scholar the most idiomatic spiritual and mystical theistic experiences. So this is quite old-fashioned view, and we should not really even bother to criticize it, I think, but just to give a sign of time. And on the other hand, Walter Stace, just around 10 years later, came up to completely different conclusion, that there are some universal features of the mystical experience, and he mentioned them: sense of objectivity, the reality of the experience, so this is very important, feeling of bliss and peace, sense of holiness and divinity, and paradoxical nature of the experience, and its ineffability. So these are the well, not so far from the William James characteristics. So when we come a little bit deeper and we compare even more, and we follow some other scholars, we can see more arguments, more and more, in favor to the view that, however, even though we see some similarities, we should not neglect differences. So cultural context makes the mystical experience really specific, really unique. So according to Stahl, this experience is culturally determined in interpretation on this level. So we perhaps perceive the same. Perhaps our knowledge gained through mystical experience is not so much different, but the tools we get from our culture, our background, make us express this experience in such a variety. And these expressions cannot be very similar. Gershom Scholem puts emphasis on the linguistic determinants. So language itself is a very, very serious barrier to compare and to see this, this universality of experience. And Stephen Katz also makes it even worse. I mean, this constructivist interpretation. He says that not only interpretation is the result of our cultural or linguistic bias, but even the content of the experience itself is culturally determined. So he goes that far, that the way we perceive, if we see the supernatural, power or something else, is actually already in our formation, mental formation. So, well, what can we now conclude to philosophize about spiritual experience? Well, we must admit that at some level we need to keep our discussion into camps, as we could say. The essentialist perspective cannot be really integrated with this constructivist, context-dependent perspective. And I don't think we can really make a solid bridge between these two. It's just two different sides of the story, I think. That's what I could say at the moment. Maybe we could try another definition, which is an open definition, to make the bridge. And this is offered by Denise and John Cormody in the 90s. They say that it is a direct experience of ultimate reality. That's it. And then we can go and explain and give more culturally, rooted information about what is actually this ultimate reality and what is this direct experience. And here I would stop for a little while. I think this is really something central. I mean, this direct experience is like becoming aware of this, what we call ultimate reality, and we are aware of something which makes such an impression that it is able to transform us in some respect. So this transformative power is something which I think might be crucial. And directness is also very important. It may mean pre-verbal, but then we, of course, we feel helpless as philosophers if we say we cannot use language, we cannot not use maybe concepts even, then we don't know what to talk about, right? So this directness is a difficult part, but direct experience is something which for philosophizing is a core thing, transformative. It must be transformative. Now we can get to more specific example of the mystical and spiritual experience which is focused on knowledge granting, and this transformative knowledge granting direct experience in the tradition of Samkhya Yoga would be seeing the difference, distinguishing between two domains of reality, both equally eternal and irreducible, Prakriti and Purusha. I don't think I need to explain because it's clear for the audience, I believe. But I would like to emphasize that the distinction and this viveka, this seeing them as not identical, also refers in Samkhya Karika to seeing the difference between vyakta avyakta. So this is even more fundamental difference, because it makes the discussion about experience and knowledge-giving spiritual experience very specific. We need to understand that some part of what is to be known is vyakta, is manifested, it is graspable, but some part is beyond our senses, is not manifest, is not graspable. So using senses is pointless. Perhaps super senses knowledge would apply, or just abductive reasoning, right? So we have the result, and we can talk about the source of what we observe. In the case of the seer, it's even harder, because we don't see manifestation. We don't see the result. So this can not be perceived by any way, anyhow, right? And it's debatable if, on the ground of Samkhya Yoga, we can say that it is super senses perception, which refers to the seer. It is a big question mark. So if we think about this direct experience, it is made from a specific perspective, right? And the perspective is quite a complex empirical self organism, which is basically psychophysical organism, body and mind together, and the intellect and the sense of ego, which makes the whole structure more dynamic and interactive, of course. And this arrow goes, this red arrow goes towards this self, which is contentless principle of consciousness, Purusha, which is in our everyday life sort of included as a part of this project, so that we act as if it is a part of the whole perceiving machinery, which is not. And this distinction and this identification is the point, is the purpose, right, of the whole effort that we put in meditative and yogic experience. So if we go now how the product of our effort is produced, so to say, how our knowledge granting experience is made, we must say that it's like, again, quite a complex multi-factor process, which leads to pratyaya or smriti, being the conviction or mental response to the impulse which we process in our psychophysical organism. And now it's the moment I would like to refer to the paper Swami kindly shared with me, where he refers to a Vivekanandan argument for the epistemic value of super senses perception. And there are some parts which refer to Samkhya Yoga, and I would like to refer to one little piece where Vivekananda offers translation of Sutra 1.7. We learn something interesting. I mean, this interpretation is quite special. The direct perception, inference, and competent evidence are proofs, he translates. So thus, there are three kinds of proofs. Pramana, he gives this kind of translation. So, and then very short explanation, pratyaksha, direct perception, means that whatever we see and feel is proof. If there has been nothing to delude the senses, I see the world, that is sufficient proof that it exists. Secondly, anumana, inference. You see a sign, and from the sign, you come to the thing signed. And thirdly, signified, sorry. And thirdly, aptavaka, the direct evidence of the yogis, of those who have seen the truth. And this, I think, is a very interesting opening to a very, very serious debate in which these questions seem like the starting point. What is the credibility of the authors of the sacred scriptures, right? What is the epistemic value of testimony? And how can we really make sure that we should rely on this kind of guidance? There are some very interesting criteria given, yes, by Vivekananda, and there are 4. This should not be just a knowledge that is shared, that is sort of obvious. It should be based on their pratyaksha, true knowledge. It must not contradict the past knowledge of humanity, and it must depend upon the character of the man who gives it out. And this I found super interesting, because this is something which redirects our focus on the ethics more than epistemology, right? So what it means that the one who shares knowledge, the authority, must be reliable. He must be a perfectly unselfish and holy person. He has reached beyond the senses. And then the 4th very important completion, the criterion number 4, is that cognition must have a possibility of verification. So there is no true knowledge which is not open for testing, being tested. And here I would say this is also an important encouragement for scientific testing, because science gives us super senses, or powerfully senses ability to realize our pratyaksha, isn't it, right? So now, just to is it 5 minutes more? 3 minutes, okay. So to be very, very brief, I think that... you
can take an extra 2 minutes if you want, so just take 5 minutes.
Okay, sorry, because I was confused with it. Just to say it briefly, I think that this, what science now can tell us about spiritual activities that we can observe when the experience is induced, is properly interpreted, is a true extra factor which helps to re-emerge real spirituality. Why? Because it gives us some very, very practical arguments to really promote any kind of activity which may at some stage really give the chance to knowledge granting experience, not necessarily right away. So if we look from, again, Samkhya Yoga, we can see that the embodied mind is what sort of produces this chance to experience, right? To experience spiritually. So this is not, I will not do it now because of the time limit, but it is not very difficult to translate into very, very up-to-date programs of programs in philosophy of mind, programs which help us to discuss consciousness in a really, really proper way. I mean, this way which we can be hopeful for in the future. So these so-called 4E or even E+ cognition programs include not only being embodied, embedded, extended, and inactive, but also they include this element of ethics, which Vivekananda included as a part of this story, elucidating what is the real authority of spiritual teacher, right? So these elements should be explained in detail with comparison to Samkhya Yoga, which I will not do it. Now I will just refer to just one more context, which comes from evolutionary psychology. And I think that what this kind of practices that yoga or meditation can give us is like something like antidotum to our general adaptation mode, which is based on concentration on the threats and these behaviors that aim at elimination of the threat. So we are in this fight or flight response mode normally. So in this mode, which we can call spiritual, we finally stop self-defense. We just quit, and we have this chance to develop non-selfish, non-self-centered attitude. And if we look from the other side, what is the hardest obstacle on spiritual path? These are these mechanisms which come from the general adaptation modes, this self-defense, ego defense, right, mechanisms. And another just association from evolutionary psychology is this metaphor, which is so much popular in a variety of traditions, which is this union, right? So union is a mystical, image, right, of the harmony that we can achieve in this stage of transformative insight, spiritual insight, and it's depicted as an act of physical union. Why? Because this is the state of trusting vulnerability, when we don't need to use any self-defense anymore, right? Because this is the place where we can grow instead of defend. Sorry for a little bit like a pace which was not perfect. Thank you for your attention, and I hope for some questions.
We have about 12 minutes for questions. So any questions from the presenters first? Yeah, Mikkel, please come to the mic.
Thanks for that, Marzenna. If you were to try to sum it up, why should anyone take seriously the accounts of mystical experiences of other people? I can see why if one had a mystical experience oneself, then it may well be considered to bring some sort of insight or knowledge. But if one hasn't had such an experience, why should one be interested in what anyone else says about their own experiences?
Thank you. This was, I think, your concern in your paper I just briefly referred to, and the Vivekananda's argument was trying to show that we need to test. We need to, of course, trust makes us listen to the authority. So this is the first stage. We must have some good reason to give a chance to the authority to tell us, the message. Then we need to verify, in a sense, that it should not be in contradiction with what is general knowledge in the field. And this is a bit tricky, because if we believe it should be in agreement, it should be coherent fully, we must ignore some controversies and contradictions that already exist in this context, right? So then...
So we must assume that we already know all there is to know about this.
Yeah. Then there is another criterion, which is about the quality, the virtuous, speaker or texts, the author we are following. So how can we really be sure that this is the virtuous teacher, right? We need to rely on others who report what was his or her life, how good this person was. So this is more and more context, more and more trust, and a kind of testing. So it's never ending and attempt to make sure, right? So it is not, I would say, a blind trust, but it is an important source which we should take as inspiration, right? As a kind of trigger that may us lead to the point when we can ourselves have this transformative experience.
Yeah, and I would just add one thing in the context of Vivekananda. So Swinburne, in relation to Mikhail's question, he defends this principle of testimony. So it's an epistemic principle based on the idea, and it's something that we rely on all the time. So every day we rely on perceptual testimony of different forms when we read newspapers, history books, and so on and so forth. And the argument would run that if we accept this uncontroversial epistemic principle of testimony, then, and we accept that mystical experience is a form of perception, then if we're applying the principle of testimony to sense experiences, then it should equally apply to mystical experiences. So that's part of the epistemic argument that I think is in relation to your question. Okay, any other questions from presenters? Yeah, Benedict. Benedict first, and then we'll open it up to general questions.
Hi, thanks for your talk. Basically, I have one or two very short questions. So would you say it's possible that, given your definition of mystical experience as a direct experience of ultimate reality, would you say it's possible that there are two mystics which have contradicting experiences, so that one says, well, ultimate reality is like this, and the other says, no, it's like this? And second short question, if, as you said, it may be the case that a mystical experience is like transconceptual or is beyond language or beyond words, how do I, in case I would have a mystical experience, know that when I express and try to communicate it, that I grasp what I really intuited or have seen in the experience? Thanks.
Thank you very much. Very, very hard to answer these questions. But the first contradiction between the authorities or just mystics who experience and they report having some extra new knowledge thanks to it, right? And the knowledge is in apparent contradiction. Well, to answer what to do with this, as I said, I would I would try to start developing the answer, choosing the perspective, either essentialist or the constructivist. I cannot say that it's one answer. So if I'm more concerned about the core, I would say one of them is using terminology or using, some phrasing which may be like the problem or maybe both, right? But this is just lost in translation, let's say. So we could try this way. But if it is the perspective which is empirical, I could say just perhaps they were so predetermined with their expectations, with their upbringing and spiritual upbringing, that they could just really experience a different phenomena like that. And there's no contradiction, because they really do experience different things, and we should accept it, that looking from different angles, we see different things. So, and if you talk about the language, the second, I'm not quite clear if it is now relevant to answer, because you meant different wording of the same experience?
If I may? No,
Yes.
What I meant is, if you say that a mystical experience is beyond conceptualization, or what I see or intuit is beyond words, how can I, as a mystic, if I were one, trust myself that whenever I try to communicate what I have apprehended is really, because apparently there's a schism between the words or the concepts and the content. So how do I bring it together in communicating it? That would be.
I think that the shortest answer to your question would be, that is perhaps, because this is a real problem, what you are describing, that is perhaps why so many mystics are silent and are very much hesitant to express themselves. Or they use poetry or some other way of expression which allows them to avoid, language traps.
We have time for one question from the audience. Yeah. Okay, you'll be Yeah, okay, fine. You go ahead. Yeah.
Madam, one thing, I'm a person of science, I'm an engineer basically. One thing I have heard one word, that science has got limitation, and where the science ends, the spirituality begins. One sentence I have heard. Can you explain it, please?
Of course, science has limitations, no doubt about it. But this is, I think, one of the best tools we have to know the reality, to adapt to the environment, whatever, and that is why we should try to find a way to integrate this scientific perspective with what we find so important, so valuable for our spiritual life, right? So if we can, for instance, thanks to technology and science, measure our nervous system activity while meditating, and it may reveal us some tendencies which are not accidental, which are quite interestingly supporting some intuition which we develop on a spiritual path. Why should we avoid integrating this objective and subjective sources of information, right? To encourage even more people to really respect what is done in this non-scientific path, right? So science can help us in promoting spirituality. That's what I believe. even though it is limited and it makes mistakes.
Okay, thank you. We have to wrap up the Q&A. I'm sorry, but you can ask Professor Jakubczak right after.
Thank you.
Okay, we have to adjourn for tea. No, you can ask her privately after the. Yeah. So thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone. Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Pranamastu. So please ask her after the session. Thank you.